Well, hello, my name is Nicolas Pons-Vignon. I am a senior researcher at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. I'm going to be talking today about the South African labour market. The situation on the labour market is a situation that is, I would argue today, characterized by very deep structural problems. And these structural problems lie at the heart of South Africa's crisis of inequality and poverty. I'm going to try and show why those problems have deep historical roots and why, in spite of the change that happened to the South African regime in 1994 with the end of apartheid and the beginning, of the ANC government, why those problems have not been addressed, or haven't been addressed in a way that makes the situation markedly better. I will also argue that the crisis situation of the South African labour market is closely associated with the crisis of social reproduction in South Africa. To be very blunt, the life of people in South Africa, of the working class, of people who depend on access to income from labour for their survival, is incredibly complicated, incredibly difficult and challenging. And while it has a number of dimensions that I will address, I think the labour market dimension is absolutely central given the political economy of South Africa. I will finish by saying a few words about what may seem to you like a paradox, namely the fact that South Africa has this very problematic labour market situation, and at the same time it has, as you probably know, what is seen as one of the strongest, most independent and in some ways most progressive trade union movements in the world. So how is it possible that with such a trade union movement South Africa has this crisis? I'll try and say a few words about this at the end of my presentation. So I talk about a structural crisis. Let me illustrate this. Firstly, one thing I want to start by emphasizing is that the access to labour market opportunities in South Africa is absolutely central to people's survival. This is not a country which, like some countries in the world, perhaps some countries further north in Africa, has a large informal sector and has people have an easy access, for example, to peasant farming opportunities. Although these, as we know, are reducing everywhere. In South Africa, that is not an option. People who do not work, whether formally or informally, usually are dependent on other people for their survival. So the unemployment figures and the employment statistics give you an important indication of the depth and width of the crisis faced by the majority of South Africans. Well, the first and most obvious indicator of the crisis of the labour market in South Africa is the very high level of unemployment. The official figure that has been used for a few years, and which follows the narrow ILO definition of unemployment, has been hovering between 24 and 27% in the last 15 years. However, it is, according to a number of colleagues of mine, including Dori Posel and Daniela Casale from the University of the Witwatersrand, it is problematic to use this narrow definition. Why? What this narrow definition does is it argues that you shouldn't count amongst the employed, or the unemployed, sorry. You shouldn't count workers who are not actively looking for work. That is commonly accepted in OECD countries, and I would say it makes sense. Right? You have a small number usually of workers who've just decided to claim they're unemployed but not actively look for work. However, in South Africa, when you add those discouraged job seekers, you don't get an increase of 1 or 2 percentage points or even 3. The unemployment rate jumps up to 35, 36, sometimes 37, sometimes 38%. A very significant difference of about 10 points, usually maybe 8 or 9 points. How do we explain this? Well, my colleagues' research shows that in South Africa, for a number of reasons I'm going to touch upon, in particular that have to do with the cost of living for poor people in South Africa, the very important commodification of their lives, the fact that anything you want to do in South Africa requires having access to money. It is actually almost impossible financially to look for work actively for a lot of people. Imagine you stay in a place called Orange Farm. Orange Farm is a recent township that was built further south even than Soweto. Soweto, I'm sure you've heard of, stands for Southwestern Township. It is located in the southwest of Johannesburg. Orange Farm is further south down the highway, maybe 40 kilometers, 35 kilometers from the center of Johannesburg. In Orange Farm, pretty much all you will find are small houses with people living there, most of them unemployed. Those people's only way to access jobs is to go into Johannesburg. But the problem, as my colleagues emphasize, is they can't afford it. They don't know how to look for work. They may not even be able to access a newspaper. And they certainly aren't able to access the resources to do an online job search. So what most people do in South Africa, given the high level of unemployment and the cost associated with finding employment or looking for work when you don't live, which is the case of many people, close to centers of employment, is called passive job search. Passive job search simply means that you wait for your extended family network to alert you to a job opportunity. Now, these people are not actively looking for work, not because they choose to spend any time in leisure rather than looking for work. They're not looking for work because they can't. It's simply impossible. Therefore, if we want to have a good idea of the level of unemployment, we need to draw on that extended definition of the South African unemployment rate, which is, as I said, around 35, 36%. It fluctuates, but it's roughly around these levels, very, very high levels. That's not all, however. South Africa is also characterized by a very low level of labor force participation, about 50%, maybe 55%. What that means is that about half of the people who are of working age and who could normally be employed, who are not sick or disabled, choose not to be engaged in the labor market. And very many of them are indeed engaged in reproductive tasks. These reproductive tasks and this rate of people who, for example, women mainly, of course, who perform these reproductive tasks is unnaturally high. One of the reasons why it's unnaturally high, some research has shown, is because, as you may know, South Africa is afflicted with a number of public health crises. One of these crises is the very high prevalence of HIV and AIDS. Another one, less known but currently even more significant, is the huge prevalence amongst especially African South Africans, black South Africans, of problems linked to very high blood pressure and diabetes type 2, the diabetes that you acquire in later life. To be very blunt, a lot of people in South Africa are sick and requiring a lot of attention, usually dying. And instead of being looked after in public institutions or hospitals or hospices or clinics, it's very often family members that have to take time out to look after them. Right? So that's one of the reasons, not the only one, why there is such a low labor force participation. But the picture it gives us is a picture of really dramatic insufficiency of employment opportunities. On top of all of this, and perhaps unsurprisingly, given the limited employment opportunities and the thirst for these opportunities in South Africa is, and has been for about 30 years really, a very growing casualization of labor. Precarious work is increasingly becoming the norm. This is, as in other places, reflected through the rise, for example, of triangular employment. A lot of people are employed in South Africa in a place by a third party, a subcontractor. Whether it's an industrial workplace, whether it's an agricultural workplace. I worked on the forestry sector, which is almost entirely outsourced with a chain subcontracting phenomenon with lots of different employers involved. But also people working in public spaces and hospitals who work for contractors. You even have in South Africa a number of police stations that are guarded by private security guards. What are the reasons behind this dramatic labor market situation? And I just decided to choose three indicators. I think they're quite explicit. Well, obviously, as is always the case in economics, and I'm sure it's the same in the other countries discussed in this panel, there's a big debate. On the one hand, many neoclassical economists in South Africa argue that the crisis of unemployment in particular has two main reasons. The first one is an inadaptation or a lack of adaptation of the skills possessed by South African workers to the needs of the economy. A skills shortage, basically. One South African economist, Iraj Abedian, famously once argued that South Africa didn't have an unemployment problem, it had an unemployability problem. People wouldn't be suited to the jobs available. The other argument that is put forward is that there is excessive rigidity in the labor market. Now, as you know, by rigidity, what economists usually mean is that it is very difficult to hire and fire workers and to get rid of them. And therefore, because it's difficult to hire and fire workers, employers tend to not employ as many workers as they would normally do because they're afraid to be stuck with workers who are inappropriate or who they don't need anymore. The truth is, however, that a number of research have shown that these two arguments are not very convincing. And it's beyond research even. Even before I mention some of the criticism, if you're an economist as well, you would know that 35% unemployment cannot be simply attributed to rigidities in the labor market, unless those rigidities were absolutely crazy, but as I will explain, it's not the case. When we talk about rigidity in the labor market causing unemployment, what we're referring to is the idea of frictional unemployment, right? Unemployment that is related to the natural movement of people in and out of jobs, and the fact that because of rigidities, that movement in and out of jobs is slowed down or not as efficiently done as it could be. That is simply not possible at an unemployment rate of 35%. It's simply, even if the labor market was fully flexible, even if there were no regulations around wages, I'll speak about that in a second. It would be obvious that you wouldn't be able to come down to full employment, right? At most, frictional unemployment could account for 4, 5, or 6%. It's very hard to judge how much it accounts for in employment related to rigidity. But what we know is from a study by a leading economist and a leading labor lawyer who've done a comparative study of a number of middle-income countries, South Africa doesn't seem to have particularly rigid labor market rules by comparison with its peers. So what is happening there, which is, I think, very peculiar, although not specific to South Africa, is that the perception of excessive rigidity is really related to the very peculiar labor relations that characterize South Africa. And to understand that, we need to go back a bit in history, which is what I'll do in a minute. What about the question of skills? Well, similarly, it's beyond doubt that there might be skills problem in South Africa, like in any economy. It's possible that they're a bit more pronounced as well, because South Africa has a skills system that is very problematic. It's, in this matter as in other matters, embraced a very British way of developing skills. It's embraced a national qualifications framework and the creation of sectoral authorities for skilling workers, which receive funds and usually do not spend them, and can only spend these funds on paying service providers to train workers. And we know that this is definitely not the best kind of system for skilling workers. The most efficient way of training workers is usually to encourage on-the-job training programs. As for the anecdote, these kinds of programs existed and were quite substantial under apartheid South Africa, but of course they were directed strictly at white workers, and they were dismantled shortly before the end of apartheid. What a number of researchers, such as Stephanie Allays, have shown in their work is that one of the core problems with skills in South Africa is that because of the racism that characterized the labor market and society before 1994, a lot of workers, black workers in particular, were able to acquire on-the-skill jobs, but not to obtain any kind of formal recognition for those skills. Let me give you an example that was once told to me and that I thought was quite striking. Under apartheid, there were very strict racial regulations regarding which kind of people, which races, could perform certain kinds of jobs. And in particular, there was something called a color bar, which prevented any black person from being above a white person in a hierarchical employment relationship. In the case, for example, of the construction industry, if you wanted to get something as simple as your house painted over, you needed to hire a white person and to contract this person as a qualified painter. What happened towards the end of apartheid is that many white entrepreneurs didn't feel that they needed to do the job themselves. So you would hire a white painter who would send you a black worker to do the painting and charge you in the invoice for the fine that the state would impose for using a black worker. These kinds of absurdities, of course, have only very partially, if at all, been addressed by the way in which South Africa has reformed its labor market. And as I said, the adoption of a very neoliberal national qualifications framework, as well as a very neoliberal way of basically commodifying the provision of skills, has led to many of the inefficiencies we see elsewhere, except that in a country with some real needs for a serious engagement with skills, it's obviously not helped very much. But part of the story is also, as I'm trying to suggest, is an ingrained racism by employers, especially white employers, who tend to dismiss or belittle or underestimate the skills that their black workers possess. There is also of course, a heterodox narrative about the unemployment crisis in South Africa. That heterodox narrative, and I was alluding to this earlier, emphasizes historical factors. In a nutshell, the argument, which I think is quite compelling, is that South Africa suffers from chronic underinvestment. There is simply insufficient investment, and there has been insufficient investment in the South African economy to create a situation of full employment. Make no mistake, that situation has been very acute since the late 1960s, early 1970s. First, because of political troubles, the collapse of the price of gold in the 70s, and subsequently the adoption of neoliberal policies, to which I'll return in a minute. But even before that, when South Africa was in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s growing at a very high rate and industrializing, there was never, on the contrary, any attempt at generating sufficient jobs to absorb all of the population. Actually, the industrialization push in South Africa was conceived as a way of dealing with what was called the white poverty problem. It was about creating jobs for the part of the white population that was living in poverty, in particular Afrikaners. But very quickly, South African capitalists understood that as they industrialized, they had to employ more and more black people on the mines and the factories, and that this was creating a danger, because industrial working classes are militant classes. They are very likely to develop trade unions, and in South Africa, they did develop very militant trade unions that played a very important part in overthrowing apartheid. So maintaining artificially a situation of structural underemployment was at the heart of South African colonialism and apartheid. You may wonder whether this would have been addressed by the new government, but it wasn't. Before the transition to apartheid in the 1980s, we see the beginnings of a shift to fiscal austerity and more broadly neoliberalism, in particular in the deregulation of financial flows. There's a short period from 1994 to 1995-96 where attempts are made immediately after the ANC is elected to address that, to spend more, to try and perform a kind of internal catch-up, right? Parts of South Africa, after all, are as poor as many parts of the rest of the continent, while others look rather like California and a very wealthy version of Los Angeles. But the ANC, to many people's surprise, decided in 1996 to embrace a firmly neoliberal program, at the heart of which lied a moderation of investment. This was a problem partly because it kept investment levels at levels that are too low for a middle-income country to grow in a serious manner, but even more so in South Africa, that are too low in order to allow this rejoining of the level of access to infrastructure between, broadly speaking, white and black South Africa. And of course, this had knock-on effects by not allowing the large-scale job creation that would have been needed to make a big dent in the high levels of unemployment. The 1980s and 90s, of course, are also characterized by a rapid process, and this continues to this day, of deindustrialization. So this deindustrialization itself contributed to the rising unemployment crisis. There are other reasons, however, that have been put forward. One of those reasons, and again that goes back to the peculiar political economy of South Africa, is the tendency by South African employers to favor capital intensity over labor intensity in many areas of productive organization. And again, this is not just, it's not a rational decision, right? If you believe that you have a large reserve army of labor and of cheap labor, especially of cheap unskilled labor, then you would imagine that a path would be taken by employers that would draw on this on this pool of cheap labor. Well, on the contrary, they tend to go for capital intensity. And I don't think you can explain that without understanding the extreme racialized, but more broadly speaking, violent nature of labor relations in South Africa. Of course, another reason is the weakness of industrial policy. There's been a formal industrial policy framework since the mid-2000s in South Africa, but all the evidence points to, so far, very ineffective industrial policy and continuing deindustrialization. So much of the available employment in South Africa is increasingly in the service sector, partly because of outsourcing in manufacturing and government and elsewhere, but also simply because in a very unequal society where effectively labor is very cheap, a lot of people end up finding work in personal services, domestic workers, gardeners, and of course private security guards to protect the rich against rampant crime, which, as is the case in Brazil, as you know, is really a consequence of inequality in the society. South Africa is, however, a very rich country compared to its neighbors. And of course it has, as a result, received large amounts of inward migration, of immigration. Both very skilled migration, because the absurdity in South Africa is that even though it's quite rich, its black population isn't trained very well. The education system has enormous problems, the education system for black people. And so it's easy to find far more qualified workers or professionals coming from many of its neighboring countries or further away countries like the Congo. But there's also, of course, been the crisis of Zimbabwe in the late 90s and early 2000s that has driven away from Zimbabwe, well, a few hundred white farmers who haven't gone to South Africa, but millions of farm workers who were expelled from the farms at the same time as the farmers, and who many of whom went to work in South Africa's agricultural sector, driving wages down. I want to continue by emphasizing that the crisis situation that I have described earlier and that I've tried to explain, pitting different theoretical and empirical interpretations against one another. I want to finish by emphasizing that this actually is linked to a very, very profound and acute crisis of reproduction in South Africa. To understand why, as I said at the beginning, you have to remember that in South Africa, the peasantry has been destroyed. This was a political project aimed at generating a large proletariat for mining, for plantation agriculture, and for other sectors. As a matter of fact, there's very little own production happening in agriculture in South Africa. People depend on monetary sources of income for their survival, even in rural areas. These monetary sources are mainly wages or transfers from wages by family members who earn wages, or social grants, the social grants that the government gives to people with children, the elderly without resources, and people who cannot work because they are disabled or sick. This crisis of reproduction and this dependence on money transfers or access to some kind of monetary resources is particularly sharp because in South Africa, part and parcel of the neoliberal orientation of the ANC government has been to accentuate the commodification of the reproduction of the working class. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by this is that most of the basic needs of working people in South Africa, or unemployed people in South Africa, are met via the market. Of course, there is a public healthcare system, but it is so overcrowded and of such a low quality that people who can afford it or who really want to try and have access to good medicine or good medical care need to pay for it. The same applies for education, and the same, of course, applies for the elephant in the room in South Africa, which is transport. Remember that one of the things that the racist British governments and then the apartheid government did in South Africa was to create a spatial division between races. In a nutshell, black people were confined to what can be called labor reserves. Those labor reserves are de facto really far away from most sources of employment. To get there, therefore, people are dependent on transport. And that transport is mostly organized in South Africa through privately owned collective taxis that are actually quite pricey and definitely not subsidized, aside from being often very dangerous. So the burden of transport costs and all of these other costs means that people's lives, people's normal lives, are constrained by money in a way that renders them incredibly dependent on labor market related income. In South Africa, we had for a few years quite a large student protest crisis in the face of rising university fees. And one of the ideas that emerged from this student protest was that there was something that the students called a black tax. And this black tax reflects exactly that crisis of reproduction. What they said is, well, unlike our white counterparts who are becoming professionals, when a black student graduates from university and becomes a medical doctor, a consultant, a salesperson in a company, he or she usually has to respond to enormous demands and expectations from the extended family in terms of helping perhaps a grandmother in the rural areas whose roof has collapsed, a cousin who needs to go to school and a private school will not accept the child if the fees are not paid, a mother who has a disease and requires a surgical intervention or money to buy medicine, or a range of other things like this. And this black tax, I think, is particularly felt by young South African professionals, especially those who are, as is the case of many university graduates, who may have incurred a substantial debt and yet unable to find jobs. You may wonder, how do people survive? I mean, I'll say a word about this. It goes back to this black tax idea. Most of survival in South Africa happens through an intersection that a colleague of mine, Ben Scully, a sociologist, has called the exchange between top-down transfers and bottom-up transfers. People who have the chance, relatively, of working and earning wages, transfer money back home to support families' dependents, especially in rural areas. In return, they receive something crucial, which is they receive the guarantee or the promise that when they're too old or too sick to work, they will be able to go back and be looked after. Or if they have children and can't afford to pay for a nanny or to keep their children with them, which is very common in South Africa, they send the children to be educated with the grandparents or other family members in the rural areas. And these transfers are essential to survival, but while some people would call them a reflection of African solidarity, I would really call it a reflection of the lack of a serious welfare state. Because you can see it with the students and many others, people resent these kind of constrained networks of solidarity rather than enjoy them. And it contributes to the fact that the South African labor market, I would say, in conclusion, is characterized by a widespread experience of insecurity and very tense labor relations, even more than 20 years after the end of apartheid. If you allow me, I'll spend another minute and a half answering a question you may or may not have asked yourselves, which is, isn't there a paradox there? Doesn't South Africa have one of the world's most progressive and militant labor movements? It does. It does. This labor movement was absolutely central to the struggle against apartheid. It mobilized workers in factories, engaged in go-slows, in productive disruption, in strikes, and also organized and worked closely with community organizations, for example, around consumer boycotts. It played a far more significant role than the International Solidarity Movement or the exiled ANC armed movement. So what happened? Well, what happened is that, as one South African scholar, Sakela Buhlungu, has articulated it, there's a paradox of victory. Trade unions in South Africa, entering the new democratic dispensation, were able to obtain their inclusion in a range of institutional fora, mechanisms, which guaranteed many of the union officials influence, wages, and more generally a certain sense of economic security and political influence. At the same time as this was happening, they very much disengaged with the bread and butter of union work, which is activity on the shop floor to defend workers or to actively challenge the ANC when the ANC was imposing very neoliberal policies. There was some challenge, but this challenge wasn't enough to change course of these policies. And of course, there still is some militancy in the South African labor movement. It's not across the board a dramatic picture, but certainly far less militancy than was the case in the 1980s. And yet this was at the time when the crisis of subcontracting and the aggressive strategies of employers were unleashed. So this paradox is really that this political influence has actually made the labor movement less militant and unable to respond to some of these labor market challenges. I cannot end this talk without mentioning, however, that the labor movement and a number of researchers in particular in the labor movement have played a key role in pushing for a relatively high, compared to the demands of business and of government, although some find it low, level for the new national minimum wage. It's only this year in 2018 that South Africa has introduced a national minimum wage. Before it had an absurdly high, I think over 70 levels of minimum wages, depending on firm size and sector, etc., and not all sectors were covered. This national minimum wage should make quite a substantial difference to the life of many workers. However, I want to alert you that research that my research unit in Johannesburg did situates it still about 1,000, if not slightly more, rands below the level that would be required for an average South African workers to be above the level of poverty, taking into consideration the number of dependents, the people that these workers support on average. So there's still quite a lot of way to go for the South African labour market to respond to the enormous challenges of the South African population. Thank you very much.